From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The dean of Stanford Law School defends the First Amendment after student protesters shut down a speech by a federal judge. But does America have a broader free speech problem? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Kim Strassel and Alicia Finley. The latest campus craziness comes from Stanford Law School, of all places, where earlier this month, a federal judge on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, Kyle Duncan, was unable to give a scheduled speech due to heckling from student protesters. Let's listen to a short clip of him calling for some administrative backup, at which point Tirien Steinbach, the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, gets in front of the microphone and gives a few of her own thoughts.
So you've invited me to speak here, and I'm being heckled nonstop. And I'm just asking for an administrator to tell me what
That's
to
an
do.
Your racism is showing.
Wait,
Respect black women.
if you want a marketplace of ideas, you have gotten what you wanted, take it.
I'm uncomfortable because this event is tearing at the fabric of this community that I care about and I'm here to support. And I don't know, and I have to ask myself, and I'm not a cynic to ask this, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is this worth it? It isn't a setup. But for many people in this law school who work here, who study here, and who live here, your advocacy, your opinions from the bench land as absolute disenfranchisement of their rights and does land.
Kim, what do you make of this controversy? To me, I guess the worst aspect here is that a dean, someone who is supposed to be helping make sure this event comes off all right, steps up and sort of sides with the hecklers and the protesters.
Yeah, it was absolutely appalling. And it turns out that she had been present at all of this, had done nothing to intervene up until that point, hadn't even introduced herself to Judge Kyle Duncan. And, she later, it was interesting, wrote a piece that we ran trying to give an accounting of her actions. And I'm glad we ran it, by the way. We believe in free speech, and she's allowed to present her side. It was a bit disingenuous and selective, as you can tell from that clip there. She was very confrontational to the judge, disrespectful to him. She got up and she delivered a prepared, it was written down on paper, 6-minute speech in which she did very much side with them. She kept saying that she believed in free speech, but she was essentially saying to him, you should never have come and been here in the first place. It isn't worth it for the controversy you are sowing here, which is the opposite of free speech. She should have been out there telling her students, especially these are Stanford Law students, by the way, okay? You would think they would have a basic understanding of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment. She should have been using this as an opportunity to explain to them those concepts. Instead, she really lambasted him, and she has apparently been put on leave at Stanford. That is at least something I think the entire law school needs to be rethinking the way that it approaches the teaching of its students.
To Kim's point, I will read a line from this op-ed in the Journal by Dean Tirien Steinbach. She said, I stepped up to the podium to deploy the de-escalation techniques in which I have been trained, which include getting the parties to look past conflict and see each other as people. My intention wasn't to confront Judge Duncan or the protesters, but to give voice to the students so that they could stop shouting and engage in respectful dialogue. I wanted Judge Duncan to understand why some students were protesting his presence on campus, and for the students to understand why it was important that the judge be not only allowed to speak, but welcomed to speak. And Alicia, it took a while, but now we have this letter last week. A 10-page letter came out from Stanford Law Dean Jenny Martinez, and it is a more substantive defense of the First Amendment. I wonder what you made of this letter and, the broader Stanford administration response.
Well, I think they were a little slow in terms of the broader administration, especially, they should have seen this coming. Ms. Steinbach's defense was completely unconvincing, especially when you consider the fact that she had actually written an email before the judge appeared, basically riling up the protesters. And for instance, she said numerous senators, advocacy groups, think tanks, and judicial accountability groups have opposed his nomination, in part because of his legal advocacy. And this was, again, when he was working in private practice regarding marriage equality and transgender voting, reproductive and immigration rights. And she basically reiterated a lot of things that she then claimed was using as de-escalation tools, that he had proudly threatened healthcare and basic rights for marginalized communities, including LGBTQ plus people, prisoners, Black voters, and women. I mean, I think the administration should have stepped in before he even came. Her email prior to his visit was just over the top and really deserved to be censored, to be honest, and that she probably deserved to be put on leave at that moment. Now, the administration and the dean of the law school has apologized, and now the students are going to have to go to, I think, a half-day tutorial, essentially, on the First Amendment, and this is essentially a slap on the wrist. I remember when I was actually at college there, and we biked around campus, and if we went on the streets and weren't wearing a helmet or didn't have lights, we would get put into traffic school. And that's essentially what this is that you have to essentially go to traffic school. But, I think that a lot, stronger disciplinary actions were warranted in this case to deter future behavior like this. And I think it's really actually depressing, stepping back, to think that these are our future lawyers, perhaps senators also of America. And these are the people who are going to be representing us in cases, contract cases, obviously the constitutional cases that could go up to the Supreme Court, that we're going to be working as clerks for justices or for appellate judges like Judge Duncan. And they're basically acting like preschoolers. And that's why I think the administration should have done more to make an example of these students. And again, let's not call this a protest. It was really a temper tantrum.
I guess I take a more optimistic view of this letter from the law dean. I'll pick out a few lines. There'd been some arguments circulating that just as Judge Duncan has free speech, the protesters also have free speech. What's wrong with that argument? Well, the dean makes pretty quick work of that. She says, while the First Amendment bars regulation of speech on the ground that listeners might find its content disturbing, the First Amendment permits the regulation of speech that substantially impairs the effective conduct of a meeting. And I suppose that should be obvious to people who are going to Stanford Law School, but to the extent it's not, she says, as one first step, the law school will be holding a mandatory half-day session in spring quarter for all students on the topic of freedom of speech and the norms of the legal profession. She also says that the role of administrators at any future event will be to ensure that university rules on disruption of events will be followed. She says that she's going to set an expectation that her commitment to DEI principles is not going to take the form of having the school administration announce institutional positions on a wide range of current social and political issues. I thought that was a nice note, given all the pressure inside some of these institutions to have them take a stance on every new voting law that a state is passing or whatnot. And Kim, to the point about discipline here, I mean, do you agree with Alicia that this is a kind of situation where the real hard line that administrators need to draw is to make an example and punish some of these students? I mean, maybe it depends on whether or not they had some sort of quiet green light from the DEI dean to hold the protest as they were having it. But the other problem is higher ed has become a pretty big business, and students are not only students, they're the customers.
First of all, just on this letter, one other point on this I would note is I was glad to see that it came out. I was glad to see the arguments that she made in it. She really dug into the point about freedom of speech, how you cannot bar speech just because you find its content disturbing, that there is no automatic heckler's veto. That is not an automatic thing that you are given. I liked, too, that she also tried to tie it to the whole purpose of Stanford law students, which is, as Alicia was saying, these people are one day going to be in a courtroom. Can you imagine them behaving in such a way in front of a judge, heckling a witness on the stand or jeering them because they didn't get the answer that they wanted? And she kind of pointed this out, saying that one of the goals of the university is to teach people to channel into persuasive argument, to actually actually put your learning to use to become an effective advocate, which nobody was being effective at anything in that room. And that gets to the question of what happens to these students. I mean, the first question I would ask is, you really have to wonder how these people actually made it into Stanford Law in the first place. I mean, we look at Stanford, it's meant to be one of the most elite universities in the country. There are tens of thousands of kids that at this very moment right now are getting rejected to going to Stanford or to Stanford Law, even though they have excellent grades. And so we have this whole question about how we're choosing people to get in anyway, which is, I think, connected to this and in terms of the caliber of those that are being accepted now. But yeah, then you essentially break all the rules, behave in a way that brings disgrace on your university, show yourself to be infantile, and there's no punishment whatsoever. I think that there should have been something, and I don't know exactly what that is, but maybe even a suspension, something like that just says, if you can't simply follow the basic credo of our university, which is that we are meant to be welcoming, that we hear from all points of view, and we do so in a thoughtful and respectful manner, then maybe you shouldn't be attending classes at the moment.